Okay, so while everybody's coming back, I was going to point out that, yeah, a couple of people in one of the breakout rooms asked if they could be California stops. Like, did they really have to count to 5? I'm like, nope, you can totally do a California stop. It's fine. It's a Google bus on a map, so you're good. So hopefully you guys all got at least a little bit of practice getting your universal algorithm to work. Although when I stopped in most of the rooms, most of you had already figured out where the answer key was, which is totally fine. It's a resource and it's there so you can use it. But the one thing I wanted to point out was basically I have issues with their version of what they say the answer should be. And so what I'm going to do is go look at the answer key. And I'm willing to bet money that Josh agrees with me on this one. So this was the field trip navigation. So when you come down to their version here, here it is. So it says, okay, great. They started off, looks fine. And then they come down here and they have this repeat all steps. Yeah, in my world, that's totally not kosher. The repeat all steps shouldn't be there because that's not an option that they gave to the kids in the directions. When I do it with kids, I make sure that this arrow comes out to a line, and that line comes up and becomes an arrow to ask, am I at the museum again? And then that way it does actually repeat all steps. This process of repeat all steps isn't a real thing. So I don't like showing the kids this version. So just be aware that if you did go and look at it, that this every time you see repeat all steps, it really should be an arrow that goes back up to the top of your flow chart. And most of the time, my kids don't ask the first question of being, am I at the museum? I'm not entirely sure why my kids don't ask that at the beginning, but almost none of my kids will ask that first. The first thing they always say is move forward. Then they'll ask, is there a sign? And then from is there a sign, they'll say, is it a stop sign? Can I turn left? Can I turn right? And then at the end, they'll ask, am I at the museum? But my kids don't usually start with that one, although ideally that is very good logic to start there. One of the other ones that, let's see, here's pretty much this is what my class does. They'll do move forward. Is there a stop sign? Can I turn left? Can I turn right? And then their last question is usually, am I at the museum? So this is one that I did with my kiddos in class, and I put a copy of it into the shared Google folder if you guys want to look at it. But this is my kids. They struggled and struggled, and finally I'm like, okay, that's it. Let's just do it together. And so this is what we came up with on that one. And I just did it the way they told me to, and I played, devil's advocate, and they went ahead and told me what to put where. And so that was one way. I'm sure Josh has other ways that he has done this.
Sure, yeah. So when I would echo that my students never want to start with the question, am I at the museum? And I kind of am the same way. I let them roll and we go all the way through it. And then they create one that they think works, with the very last question being, am I at the museum? And then what I do is we walk through the algorithm, and then what happens is because their first step was move forward, when they loop back through, we'll actually get to the museum, and because of where they've placed the question, am I at the museum, we have to go in order. So the first question was for them, I think, can I turn left? The answer is no. The second question was, can I turn right? The answer is yes. So because the answer is yes, they're turning right, and then what does it say to do after that? It says move forward. So we actually blow right past the museum if we don't put the am I at the museum at the beginning. So then I make them, as a class, we move it around. And mine looks pretty similar. This is what we ended up, that's what we ended up with for a final. I start, ask the question, am I already at the museum? If I am, well, I'm done. Easiest flow chart ever. If I'm not, move forward, ask a question. They started with, can I turn left? I'm assuming they asked that question first because when they were actually doing the path, that was the first thing that showed up. So my students always say, can I turn left first? And the order here doesn't really matter. Whether you said, am I at a stop sign first, or can I turn left first, or can I turn right first? So I say, can I turn left? If I can, I want to. If I can't, can I turn right? If I can, I want to. If I can't, I must be at a stop sign, or I'm at the museum, which I already would have been done. If I'm not, or if I am, I go there, and there's no. The no should go back to, am I at the museum? But that's going to make a mess.
The other thing I was going to comment was I had a whole bunch of people say, okay, well, it kind of works, but it's really ugly. Yeah, that's okay. And I tell my kids that too. It's okay that your universal algorithm is super ugly to begin with. It's a work in progress. Your algorithms will get better. And sometimes I get to the point where I'm just like, oh my God, they finally drew an algorithm. Thank you. And we move on. And I don't pay all that much attention to how ugly it is. And sometimes they're really ugly. I've got kids who take up 3 giant pages in their notebook with stuff scribbled everywhere and lines all over the place. That's ugly. So just be aware that it is okay that your algorithms are not always beautiful and straight and perfect. And you might just have
Maya?
to let that happen. Yes.
In my classroom, I have 4 whiteboard tables and then 2 walls of whiteboard. And so I let them draw their algorithms on the whiteboards, and they are particularly ugly because they get a little wild when they have the whiteboards. And then I just have them take a picture of it and submit that. But they really do like doing, if you have whiteboards in your room, they really do like doing them on the whiteboards. And it's a good way to get collaboration. Because they can draw it pretty big, they can all see it, so they have fun with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. The talk of whiteboards reminded me of a question from one of the breakouts I was in about using the maps, actually physically using the maps. And one thing that I have heard of people doing is if your whiteboards are magnetic, I've heard of people projecting the map onto the whiteboard and then enlarging the tiles and putting them on magnets and physically moving it around the whiteboard for the students, or having the students physically move them around the whiteboard, which was kind of an interesting way to do it without actually passing out the maps to every student if you didn't want to. But as you can see, pretty is better, so I've made my lines nice and pretty well. Maya was talking about the fact that they could still be ugly, but that's nice. Straight lines are significantly better when we're going through that. So,
hey, Josh, I have a question real quick.
I have an answer.
Good.
Maybe.
This is Doug. We were looking at the lucid charts while we were in our breakout room, and you could go in and do a free account real quick. But it says you can do 10 charts, or I think 100 meg or something like that. Is that only 10 charts, or is that, because you either have to pay for it or you can do.
Lucid,
I got to tell you,
chart said that?
yeah, I didn't pay for anything, and I have a lot more than 10 charts. The other thing,
Yeah, same.
I think the 10 charts are to save on their server. If you connect it to your Google Drive, it saves to your Google Drive, and then I think you can have as many charts as you want.
I have had that problem with the limited charts, and that was kind of why I went to draw.io. It will only, when I was using it, it would only save 3, but you could make a new one, it would just get rid of the old one. So you weren't limited to making 3, you could only just keep 3 at a time. But if they've upped it to 10, that's an improvement. But one thing you can do if you want to use the lucid chart, once you get it made, just take a screenshot and save the screenshot.
Yeah, and Josh
Yeah.
is showing you right now downloading it as a JPEG or a PDF or a PNG file. And I often have my kids download them as PDFs and then turn that in, or JPEGs, so they can paste them into something.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's what you can do the screenshot. Some of them don't like that it shows the grid marks when they're done. If they're like me, they don't like that. So some of them would go ahead and print it. And then there's actually a shortcut, so you wouldn't even have to download it. If you get to the step, so if I did a file download as PDF, if I right click it, I can copy that image directly from there. So it actually saves one little step. I could copy it and then paste it in. One of my students found that last year. So it saved them the process of downloading it to their computer and then uploading it back to their doc, which was kind of neat. So, I will put my universal algorithm in the shared folder, and also probably on community if you guys want to take a look at it. It's definitely not the only way to do it. Like we said, Maya showed one example, I showed another example, but if you want to use that to help you as you are, it's question 1.4, that universal algorithm is a submission item for the concept assignment 1. All right. So we're going to kind of wrap up here. Maya's going to take you through activities 1.3 and 1.5 are part of what you need to do for concept assignment number 1.
Yes, so the first one is the germ guide, activity 1.3. This is the student version that I'm in. And again, they give the student starter code, which is always nice because then they don't have to worry about how to make a new screen and everything else. So that helps. They've got some good vocab in here that you might want to keep an eye on with your kids, especially incremental approach. That actually comes back a couple of times. It gives them a nice little video, but the general idea is that there's a World Health Organization needs an app for non-medical personnel, non-medical volunteers, to be able to go to places where there have been outbreaks after a natural disaster. And so the person can click on the button for, well, I think it's measles, and hear a description of what measles should look like. And they can say, oh, okay, well, I think you have measles. You need to go over here and see this doctor. Or, gee, that doesn't sound right. Click on cholera. Yeah, that sounds more like it. You need to go over here and see this doctor. And so that's kind of one of those things. And actually bringing that up will help your kids kind of buy into it a little bit. But the idea is that you're going to have a user interface, which is, we shorten it to UI, that's going to have 3 buttons on it, and those 3 buttons go to 3 different screens. Each screen has 2 buttons on it, and each button will play a description of measles or meningitis on the crowding screen, cholera, etc. on the waterborne illness screen, and then malaria. And she says dengue fever. I always thought it was pronounced dengue fever, but either way. The back buttons will I think the back buttons all work, and they give you a nice layout of what this looks like. When I do this with kids, I make them actually draw this. I don't show them that it's here yet, and then when they scroll down and see it, they get really mad at me. But that's okay, because then they've had practice drawing and showing how they want everything to connect. And it goes through and talks about the control layer versus the view layer. And so I make a big point of talking to my kids about everything that the user sees and can interact with. That's your view layer. And that the control layer is everything that controls that. And so they go through, and they're pretty good about going step by step through 1.3 to get you to the point where your buttons work and everything plays, and they have you going through and doing this pretty well. It's pretty step-by-step, pretty cookie cutter for 1.3. Basically, all 1.3 is going to do is it's going to play the sounds, and it's going to annoy you because the sounds are going to play over each other, and when you hit the back button, the sounds are going to keep playing. don't fix it yet. Wait until you get to 1.5 in decision time. That's when we actually have the kids go and fix that. And I got to tell you, I always warn my kids, don't fix it yet. It's coming up in a future assignment, because they actually do want to fix it. It really does bother them, which is odd, but still. And having them go ahead and do the fixes and talking about the conditional statements works really well. Boolean logic is another big important concept that's going to come back again. So make sure you kind of focus there for a little bit. And it does go through and show them how that looks as a flow chart, and then goes through and gives them, this one is tough. My kids always skip over this part that shows them how to do the mutator. I liken a mutator to being throwing radioactive goo on a spider. He gets extra legs and superpowers because that's how mutation works, right? So that's how I liken that little blue gear to a mutator. I'm like, where's your radioactive spider? And they all go, oh, right, because they'll remember that. For some reason, they won't remember the actual word mutator. But they go, oh, the radioactive thing, and they click on it, and they'll remember that. But maybe that's just my kids. I don't know. But it goes through and shows you how to add things on there and gives you some really nice, good directions for getting that sorted out. So, okay, so quite a few things there for 1.3 and 1.5, but I'll be honest, they're all pretty much step by step. The homework assignment for this week is going to ask you to turn in screenshots of the completed crowding screen designer blocks and designer and blocks editor. So that's one of the 3 screens. So don't do all 3 if you're in a crunch for time. They only need the pictures of the crowding screen for the designer window and the blocks. And then for 1.5 is the completed flow chart, and then the designer window and the blocks for the crowding screen. And then the conclusion questions are what you're going to have for your submission. So I don't want to keep anybody. I know we've got 2 minutes to 6 down here on the West Coast. So I want to open it up for questions, see if anybody has anything, or if you need any clarification, or I went too fast, or what have you.
One thing about the conclusion questions I want to mention, in the past, I've had a lot of people taking the online course saying that they weren't like, I don't know what to answer for the conclusion questions. They're literally at the bottom of the document, or of the task, so activity 1.5. This one's a little bit weird because it says you are not expected to work in App Inventor to complete this task. It says, but then it also says to arrange the block. So for submit, I think this was like they have to do the conclusion questions for this. So for submitting this, you can do it a variety of ways. One way would just be to literally say what you're doing. So when the picture boxes change, if, and then what would go in the if thing, like writing it out with text. Or if you want practice with App Inventor, you certainly can create a checkbox that's named picture checkbox and create a, well, that would be the only thing, picture button on App Inventor, and then physically place them in there. I know some people who have this and then they have the students cut it out and then they drag them on top of each other and then they take a picture of that. For my students for this question, I actually created a starter code that just has, it's got all the boxes already built. So it's got a picture checkbox, it's got a picture button. And then they know that they got it right because they deploy it to the app and they test it and they say, oh, well, when I did this, did it show a dog picture? And when I did this, did it show a cat picture? So just do your best when you're answering that conclusion question. That's the most common mistake on this submission is people don't answer the conclusion question, and then we have to send it back and say, you didn't answer the conclusion question. And then you say,
I have a question on when you're submitting the screenshots. Do you want also the designer screenshot and the block screenshot
I believe so.
for each activity? So you would have 2 for 1.3 and 2 for 1.5.
Yes.
Right.
So you're gonna have,
And one of them for 1.3 and 1.5 will look the same.
Okay.
Because
so
the
the
designer's
designer
not changing.
window will pretty much look the same, but
Yeah.
the box will be different.
Yes, yes.
But
Okay.
you're only doing one
Okay.
of your 3 screens, so you're only going to do the crowding screen. And I would encourage you to do
Yes,
all of the
yes.
screens, but that's if you need the practice.
Okay. I have a question too about the I'm doing 2 monitors because it's just easier for my students. And when they screenshot, it shows both screens. Is that okay to submit mine with both screens on there?
I don't see why it wouldn't be. But after
Yeah,
you
as
submit
long
it,
as you can read it.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Okay.
when you paste a screenshot in, you should be able to like crop it to get rid of anything that
Well,
doesn't make
I haven't tried that yet. So, but I thought tomorrow I'd try to crop because I worked on it today.
What are you using to do? Are you just doing like an alt print screen, or what are you doing to capture your screenshots?
The Windows button and print screen.
Okay. What version of Windows do you have?
10.
10. So there is something called the snipping tool
Uh-huh.
that you can use as well if you want to just capture that little portion instead of
Okay.
the
Okay.
whole thing.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's all my questions.
Well, it's 2
Question
after 6,
also.
so if you
Can I
need
ask a
to
question real
go,
quick?
you go.
Oh,
yep.
And we'll definitely stay and hang around and answer all your questions. So go ahead, Stephen.
Whenever you do 1.3 with your students, do you just kind of essentially turn them loose to go through the pace, or do you do that kind of like on a board and at the front of the class and they go step by step with you? I did that at 1.1 and I found that to be extremely slow to doing it that way. So I was just curious on how y'all do it.
Well, what I usually do for 1.3 is I go through and I do the introduction all together. I spend about 10 to 15 minutes getting them set up, having them draw out where stuff's going to go, planning it out, and then I just go, great, now here's your partner, go get to work. And I just cut
Okay.
them loose, and then I just circle the room
Circle around.
constantly for the rest
Okay.
of the next 2 periods or however long it takes them to finish it.
Okay.
And if I get kids
Sounds great.
running
Thank you.
early, I can get them to help, but
Right. Okay.
Pretty much for any activity in my room, I really quickly give them a brief overview of what they're going to do. I hit kind of like the key steps, and if I know for sure there's places where students typically struggle, I'll say, I won't necessarily give them the answers, but I'll say, hey, be really careful on step 50. This is where we have a lot of students that have either a misconception or they read over it or miss something. So that's kind of places where they'll highlight in there. Because on the courses website, they can actually highlight things or take notes or whatever, and then they'll actually highlight that thing and say, okay, that reminds me I need to pay specific attention to this portion.